Be still and know that I am God. Welcome to today's selected study topic from the Bible. Welcome to our continuing study on God's love for man. We're in Lesson 5. Now, in our previous lessons, we have seen that the man who God created was far different from all other creatures on the face of the earth. We can observe as we study the pages of Scripture this progress, this growing evidence for the uniqueness of this love that God has for man, and we see this through his personal care and attention given to man. As we look through the creation account in the early pages of Scripture, we see that abundant food was provided for man, and God made a garden especially for him. This man was to be engaged in the keeping of the garden, and he was involved, as we saw also, in the naming of the animals that in the garden here in God's creation. God also observed the need man had for fellowship and companionship, and he met this need by the forming of the woman. In this lesson, though, we're going to look at a little deeper into perhaps the character and the traits of man and this creature that God made in his own image and likeness. So man is, we can see, is a rational and a moral being. Now man is intelligent, and the uniqueness of his creation, and we look at that man being made intelligent, how he was made, the uniqueness of man cannot be overemphasized. The fact that he was made in the image and likeness of God is of the utmost importance for us to understand. Now, if we study angels, we find that angels are also intelligent beings, and they possess intellect, emotion, and will. But only man was created in the image and likeness of God. And Genesis 2:7 shows God's unique creation of man. We went through and saw that early in lessons. God made man personally. God didn't just speak man into being as he did other things in the universe, but he personally formed man. Now, immediately following the special creation, we see that God starts his personal care for man. And we look in Genesis 2:8, we see that God made for man a garden eastward in Eden. And having planted this garden, the special attention was continued, it says in verse 8 also, that he put man there himself, the man that he has formed. And in this garden, in verse 9 of chapter 2, we see that God put every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. Now, including among these trees, we also find the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, after a description of the waters and the precious minerals and stones that were also placed near the garden, God's special abode for man, Scripture records that man was placed in the garden with a purpose. He had been placed there, it says in 2:15, to dress and to keep it. Here we see the fact that man was created as a rational being. God was able to communicate a desire for man, and man was able to fulfill it. Man was able to understand that communication, follow through with what God had indicated for him to do. What we see here is the uniqueness of man as compared to the other parts of living creatures on the face of the earth. Man could communicate on a rational level. But we also see, even deeper in this, man is a moral being. As God continued to communicate his will to man, he first gave a charge to man, saying, and this is in 2:16, if you're following through in Scripture, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. Now, that's just part of the verse, because he's going to put limitations on this. God communicated these limitations in the same verse. In verse 17, it says, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. Here God communicated his will to man. It was man's responsibility to obey. So here we see a divine order established. God is the creator God, and man is the created being and is to obey God. It is man's responsibility to obey God. God had made man in his own image. and as such, man was fully capable of knowing and understanding this. Now, God had communicated to man and gave man commands, and man had been created in such a way to be able to obey God in what God had commanded. He had been made with the ability to obey, but we also see he was created with the ability not to obey. As we can say, he had the ability to sin, and we can say right and wrong. He had the ability to do right, and he had the ability to do wrong. God commanded, and man could choose to obey or not to obey. Man could make the moral choice between one or the other. Now, God communicated to man the difference between obeying God and not obeying God, the difference between obedience and disobedience. He communicated the value of one choice over the other. Man did have the ability to choose to be disobedient, but God conveyed that this moral choice came with consequences. Man was forbidden to eat, and it says in 2:17, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For if he chose to disobey this command, it was told in 17, in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. So man had been created with the ability to sin or not to sin. The choice was given him by the uniqueness of his creation. Because man was created in the image and likeness of God, he was able to make this moral choice. The penalty of choosing the latter was communicated to his mind that had both rational and moral understanding. He could understand the truths communicated to him. He could understand the wonderful things that God had provided him would benefit him physically. He could also understand that God was worthy of his obedience, with such obedience would benefit him spiritually. He knew that not eating of the food provided would hurt him physically. He also knew that not obeying God would hurt him both physically and spiritually. He knew he had been given the option of choice. He had choice of which one to take. He could think this through on a rational and a spiritual or a moral level. God had made man this way. God had made man so, because man was made in God's image and likeness. As we finish today's lesson, let's summarize some thoughts on what we have observed about the man created in God's image and likeness. As God created everything that is other than man, he spoke it into existence by his power of his word. By his spoken word alone, these things came to be. As we've noted, this was not so with man. With the creation of man, God had a desire to make man in his own image and likeness. This he did by forming man, his natural side, from the dust of the earth. God took the dust of the ground and formed man's body. But the body that he made from the dust of the earth did not live. It did not live until God breathed into this man the breath of life. This gave man his soul and spirit. And this made him far different from anything else living on the face of the earth. Man had been made with God-breathed life. He had intelligence. He had intellect, emotion, and will, as God has. God could fellowship with man, and man could fellowship with God in a way that no other creature on the earth could. Man did fellowship with God from the day of his creation, as we see in the early pages of Scripture. He inhabited the garden personally made by God. A man named the animals which God had made and brought to him to name and to observe. God was there to meet every need of man, particularly for a complementary person to share his life. God personally put the man to sleep to remove the rib from his side to form the woman. This perfect mate was brought to man, personally brought to man by God himself. This personal, perfect care was unique from all other parts of the creation. To the specially made man, God gave dominion over all the physical world. Man became God's appointed representative to rule over the physical creation. As David later wrote in Psalm 8 and verse 5, God crowned him with glory and honor. Man truly was a very special creation in the eyes of God. To man, God gave the commands, thus setting the divine order of things. God was the created God, and he was to be obeyed. Man was the creature, a created being, and he was subject to this created God. But this relationship was far different from all other things in the earth. All things celestial except angels, and all things terrestrial other than man, are subject to God and follow him by design. They have no other choice. They are subject to him. They have no other option. They, by design, bow to him as creator. Man, however, was made differently. God desired to fellowship with man and expected obedience, yet he designed man in such a way that man would fellowship and obey God by his own personal will. Man could willingly fellowship and obey God by choice. He was also given the ability to choose to not obey. He could choose the other way. He had the ability to disobey. God wanted to love and fellowship with man, but he wanted man to respond willingly. It was to be man's own choice. Apart from angels, no other part of creation was created so. Man was special to God from the day of his creation. As we study Scripture, we can see that this special care for man has not changed, even with man's choice to disobey. God still loves man and wants the very best for him. If you read in the Gospels in John 3:16, it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." We see that this love that God mentions, that John mentioned in John 3:16, was true in the day that John wrote it, in the time of the Gospels, but it was also true from eternity past. In our next lesson, we will see the wrong choice man made and the consequences of that choice. We will also see the undiminished love of God for man, the man created in the image and likeness of God.